Lee's Morning Vibes, I have to go back to using my inside voice. I had a whole hour, our stories, and so now it's time for our guest, Brother Ako Mutota. Morning, Brother Ako.
Yeah, good
Oh, my
morning,
brother, there, I
everyone.
notice you.
Listening
There you
audience.
go.
Good to see you again. Good morning to you and to the listening audience. And thanks for inviting me to this program this morning.
You're welcome. We're used to seeing you on Sunday, not a big Friday morning, 10 past 8 Belize time. How are you being, Brother Akka? It's raining, at least where we are in Southside Belize City, it's raining. How are you being
Well,
this morning?
I am well. Right now, I am actually in St. Louis, Missouri. I am visiting the US, so I am here on some business. So I'm talking to you from St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay, is it a different vibes? Like, what are the vibes that the States right now?
Well, it's different from Atlanta, where I lived previously. I spent some time here before because I lived in Chicago for a while and I would visit. So the Midwest is different to some extent culturally from the South, and different behavior, and so on. So it's different. Yeah.
Okay, good, good, good. Well, this morning we have you because we want to talk about non-governmental organization. So, when did non-governmental organization become something where you had an interest in now? How and when it get on your radar?
A long time ago, actually, when they became very prominent in Trinidad and Tobago, and I had a concern about what I considered outside influences in community activity. I first felt it in our community, which is dominated by a number of oil companies. And one of the initiatives of these oil companies was to set up NGOs in the community, which sort of undermined the social fabric of the community and created to some extent a kind of dependency syndrome. Whereas in the past, there were things that we would do as a community, very, very, independent, pool our resources together and collectively act. What started to happen from my observation was that things that we could have done, we no longer did them out of our own initiative, but depended significantly on the multinational corporations in our communities to provide things, that we should have done. And in the end, it undermined, in my opinion, the initiative of the community, the independence of the community, and created a lot of divisions within the community. At a particular point, anything that you pull people together to do. And I had that experience working in one of the communities. We pull, normally if we wanted to do something, we will do fundraisers, get people to make contributions, and so on. And there was a particular community I was working in, and I put this simple thing to them for us to do something. And the first thing they said was, let's go to the oil companies. And I said, why do we have to go to the oil companies to raise something like $500 for transport? Those are things that we've done for years, generations. Being self-sufficient, being independent, and being supportive of each other. And so when the oil companies came with that, they brought a culture that created dependency. What I call it, and I refer to it a lot as a mendicant mentality, in the sense that we beg for everything. I'll give you a clear example. I was born and grew up in a very small rural community called Guayaguayari on the southeast coast of Trinidad. We had no electricity. I did homework and my schoolwork by what was called a pitch or a lamp up until I was 12 years before electricity came to the community. We did not have a community center. We had a hall that was owned by a private individual. And so the young people in the community wanted a space. And those young people I'm referring to would be my uncles and cousins and other people of their age in the 1960s. So I would have been possibly about 8 or 9 years. And so they wanted a space, which they didn't have. And what they did was to create a space and they named that space Bamboo Inn. And the reason it was called Bamboo Inn is because they went and cut bamboo in the bushes to build the walls. They cut a particular kind of, I don't know what you call it in Belize, but we call it roseau. It's a kind of tree where you use it to build houses and so on. And the roseau and what they used to mix the sand for the flooring was sea sand and chip shells, which is a shell that comes on the beach. And they built this building on their own without any help from any outside force, not even the government. Local business people, they did what in the day we used to call it parcel evenings, raffles, bingos, and people made their own contributions. And they built this thing called Bamboo Inn. And it was, the roof was not galvanized. It was a thatch roof, what we call karat. It's a palm, which I know exists in Belize also. And for years, that became the center of the community. Weddings, I went to several weddings there. They would have all fours events and all kinds of community events. So that is the kind of environment I grew up in which if you wanted something for your community, you mobilize the community and you pool your resources together to get it done. And therefore, everyone felt part of this initiative and everyone felt that they contributed to this initiative, either directly or indirectly. And so when the NGOs came to our community, mainly through the oil companies, firstly Amoco, then BP, then Repsol, the Spanish company, and several others, you know, when they came to the communities, they brought this thing called the NGO. And immediately the NGOs divided the community because there were those who were higher up on the social pecking order who were immediately identified as the people they want to be in leadership of these organizations. And so on. And at the end of it all, these organizations began to create divisions in the community. They undermined the social fabric of the community. They discouraged what I call general communal mutual support, because now BP could give you $100,000 or $50,000 to do something, and a lot of these people utilize that monies, right? So like in one case, I know one family dominated the formation of the NGO, and they use that money to enrich themselves. And so it created strife and disorder in the community. So my particular experience with NGOs from the beginning was not very good. Now, at a political level, how did these NGOs emerge? Now, these NGOs, so I'm moving away from my community now. How did these NGOs emerge? What I would consider the origin of the modern NGO. The modern NGO are what lawyers like to call legal creatures. They were created by law as entities to supposedly do good and encourage charitable endeavors and so on in communities. But the reality of it is that the modern NGO is a creation of US foreign policy. And because we don't read history, we are not understanding the origin of a lot of things that impact us negatively in the Caribbean. The modern NGO, and I refer to the term modern NGO, and some people have defined another term for them, not non-government organizations. They say they are near government organizations. And I think it's a very important thing to denote a non-government organization as against a near government organizations. I'm going to explain to you how that term emerged, which is emerged in Germany, the near government organization. Now, the non-government organization, the NGO, the modern NGO as we know it, was an initiative led by Robert McNamara, who was then the head of the World Bank. Previous to his ascension to being the head of the World Bank, Robert McNamara was the Defense Secretary of the United States and led the war in Vietnam. You understand? And anyone who understands what happened in Vietnam, the US committed brutal acts of aggression against the people of Vietnam in their so-called domino theory, saying that you had to prevent communism from taking root in Southeast Asia and in the world in particular. And they said that if one domino fell, the others would follow. And so this war was waged against Vietnam for a long time. And so Robert McNamara was the defense secretary during that war. After the war, he became the head of the World Bank. And everyone knows what the World Bank has done in the world. There's lent money to African countries and Asian countries and created the debt trap, which they're accusing China of. So what he did as part of his policy at the World Bank was to set up organizations that he felt could pursue objectives and other kinds of projects outside of the state sector. And that is the origin of what we call the modern NGO. Now, there are some have who tend to believe that the modern NGO is really independent. There may be some, but there is an important saying that whose bread I eat is whose song I sing. And a lot of the NGOs are funded by outside sources who are not particularly independent. And these sources have agendas that they want to pursue in particular countries. So, for example, one of the major funders of NGOs is Soros Foundation. And Soros, George Soros, who's the founder of that foundation, has an what he call anti-communist bent, and is part of the neoliberal dispensation, which is a kind of economic, political, and social philosophy that sees government as a problem and therefore seeks to minimize the influence of government on populations and tend to want to promote this neoliberal agenda as the solution to civilization and to governance. Now, it all emerged out of the Thatcher-Reagan years. And a fundamental aspect of the neoliberal paradigm or agenda is the idea of privatization. That services that the state should provide, and they come to believe to some extent that the state is not particularly effective, and they suggest that these sectors should be privatized by corporations. So, like for example, in the US here, there was a big move to privatize education because it is the last sector of what you may call the social sector of the US that is not more or less privatized. And so they are now moving in a direction to privatize education because they are seeing it as an opportunity to make millions. But what happens with privatizations is that it is very selective in whose approaches. It appears, and its rhetoric is that it provides for everyone. But whenever you have to make a profit and you see profit as the major incentive of anything, there are going to be people who are left out. And so, in order to supposedly take care of those who have been marginalized, the inventions of the modern NGO comes into place. And so governments tend to utilize these NGOs, so-called NGOs, to perform services that ideally and is the responsibility of the state. And that is what I consider one of the fundamental contradictions of the modern NGO. Relative to their so-called independence, there are many cases in which they have influenced policy. For example, if you look at a very powerful NGO in the US called the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation created the ideological, social, and intellectual foundation for Ronald Reagan, who, as we know, was one of the most dangerous presidents the United States experienced in terms of his racist policies towards people of color, in terms of his warmongering policies, and in terms of dismantling the states and intervention. He was a man who intervened in Venezuela. And the Heritage Foundation is very much a template for the modern NGO. It creates policy, it influences government, and their role in so many instances is to undermine governments whose policies do not align with US policy. So this is my initial response to your question.
A long answer, Brother Akko, even though it was a comprehensive answer. So I will have to have you beyond 8:30. So we're going to try to keep the answer shorter so we can get as many questions in as possible. We have another 5 minutes before we got a break. So one of the things I want you to focus on is that government have a responsibility to the people of that country. Something happened why government, instead of using the money for the people's interest, you have corruptions and having to pay back loans why they can't provide the social services. So that the part the NGO come in for filling in the gap where part, well, government not able for the social services. One. Two, you make the point how things used to be in your community. So let's say in the 60s, maybe in the 50s, you had active union work. No, you don't have one active union in the for example, in the Caribbean region. That's where the NGO come in. So you not see any meaningful use of NGOs fulfill the gap where government they fail and fulfill the gap where you don't have active unions anymore?
Well, to say, for every, I am not anti-modernist. And I believe that, as humans evolve, there are needs, or there is the need for adaptability. So there are things that we may not have thought about 30 years ago that, that came into being that are very beneficial. My concern, one of my primary concerns with the modern NGO is that we have had systems of mutual support in the Caribbean, right? So for example, in Belize, you had the Friendly Society, okay? I know it existed in Trinidad too. And what was the Friendly Society? It was it was an organization that lent mutual support to people in times of trouble. If you had financial problems, they would lend you a little bit of money. If your house, got some damage. In my community, a lot of it was for funeral. If you died and you couldn't afford, they will pay your funeral service and support your family and so on. So you had those kinds of mutual aid support, which were in fact people-centered organizations, which emerged from the traditions and culture of the people. So the Friendly Society was one. Then you had in Trinidad, and I don't know if you have it in Belize, but I know in Trinidad and St. Vincent you have it, something called GAIAP. And GAIAP was a system of support and cooperation in which people help people build homes. If you want to build a road in a difficult place to build houses. And the GAIAP system, from what I understand, emerged from the indigenous population, a term called Kayapi, I think it is, which was again collaborative and mutual in support. Then you had things like what we call lend hand, which was similar to the GAIAP, lend a hand. Then you had Susu, right, in Trinidad, which originated from the Yoruba word Esusu, which means, and that has a repetition throughout Africa. And I know in some Caribbean islands they call it box and so on and so forth.
In Belize,
so
they call it syndicate.
Right. So we had those kinds of mutual aid organizations and supportive organizations that emerged from our own indigenous traditions. What has happened is that there has always been an attempt, right, to erode our sovereignty. And it begins by tackling and challenging and undermining the legitimacy of your own cultural traditions. It begins with your food, for example, right? So now we moved away from our food, and all we're doing is eating KFC and McDonald's. And so it also permeates our cultural life. And so a significant organization like the GAIAP or the Lenhan or the SUSU, these things have been delegitimized. And once these cultural and social vacuums are created, then the people are left to fend for themselves. And where the state should intervene, because the model of organization of the state is modeled around the capitalist model, and a model that does not serve the people, because it was designed to serve foreign entities from the time of our enslavement to the time of colonialism, and now in the era of neo-colonialism. So we are following the dictates and the diktats of foreign entities about how we should run our state. So, for example, if they said in the US we should privatize education, do not be surprised if the governments in the Caribbean follow that lead and start to implement policies to privatize education. And we have a case in Trinidad and Tobago, for example. In 1970, the revolutionary movement fought to nationalize the banks, and the government was forced to respond to that initiative. But they launched what we call the counteroffensive against the population, right? And they promoted American ideas, American culture. You listen to our radio stations, you will swear you're in the US in terms of how even the announcers speak. And what happened with the advent of the neoliberal agenda, the government began to follow US neoliberal policy and denationalize the banks and other sectors of the economy. And this is what they do in the social sector. And so once you create a vacuum, and as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. Once they create a vacuum, which is a social vacuum, then they create a legal entity, or what lawyers call a legal creature, to fill the vacuum that they can determine how it works. And this is how I see the modern NGO in the context of Trinidad and Tobago society and Caribbean society, in that the responsibility, as you said, the responsibility of the state is diminished based on policies they follow, initiatives imagined from outside of our societies. And these initiatives are followed by our politicians and our corporate and civic and social leaders. And then they implement these policies, creating what I call social spaces, creating economic spaces and cultural spaces that are now filled by these entities who are really more like Trojan horses. And we can talk about the concept of Trojan horse later on. So I hope I haven't
Okay.
been too long with this.
Okay, so Arundhati Roy, who is an author
Yes.
among other things, said NGOs are what could be described as an indicator species. The United States, for example, would declare war on someone and then immediately have NGOs ready to go in and assist the people who they created harm to. And Haiti would be one of those countries. I think Haiti may have the most NGOs in the world, if I'm not mistaken. We'll take a quick break and come back, continue our conversation with Brother Ako Mutota, Black Power movement worker all my life, the Trinidad and Tobago around the world, and the current co-host of Sunday Review and XTV Contents, the only news review talk show in the country on the only black-owned media in the region. Break time. To Wake Up Belize Morning Vibes, Sister Yaya sitting in for Brother Nuri Mohammed. We have with us on a Zoom call Brother Ako Mutota from Trinidad and Tobago, but they're a white man land right now. Brother Ako, we're talking about non-governmental organizations. Now, one other thing I learned from doing research about NGOs is that there's now a buffer between governments and people who are being more politicized and take more radical actions. And it tend to be people who have colonial papers or degrees. And Arundhati Roy say, real resistance have real consequence and no paycheck. So, and I was saying, I think Haiti might be the country that have the most NGOs in the country. So make I get your 2 cents on how NGO take the edge off of people who that normally resist oppressive conditions because of failure of state, and so a buffer between oppressed people and the state.
So, Sister Yaya, is such an important question.
I think, wait,
You
take
hear
off
me?
the earpiece. Go ahead.
I said it's such an important question because I'm going to read some from some reports here, opinions of people who have studied the NGO. Now, the question you asked about Haiti, it is absolutely correct. Now, there is a political philosopher called Peter Hallward who has studied NGOs. He's a Canadian. And one of the things he said is this, that he has accused NGOs of preserving imperialism and sometimes operating in a racialized manner in what he considered third world countries of the global south, with a function similar to that of the clergy during the colonial era. Now, if you understand what he said there, the church was the other end of the sword relative to slavery and colonialism. When the conquistadores came with their sword and their spears and their muskets, those who resisted physically, the church tried to make them not resist mentally and spiritually. So the church was a significant part of the colonization and the enslavement of people in what was considered the New World. And he has accused NGOs of functioning similarly to the clergy. He goes on to say, they are an aristocratic form of politics, which is what you just talked about there, the elitist tendencies, the people who have all 3 and 4 degrees. He said they are an elitist and aristocratic form of politics. And he also noted that Action Aid and Christian Aid, 2 NGOs, effectively campaigned and condoned the 2004 US-backed coup against an elected government of President Aristide in Haiti. So that answers what you are just saying there. The elitist, and he documents it in a couple of his books. Peter Hallward. So those who want to get more information can look at his work on the role at NGOs. And he goes on to say, there are also the humanitarian face of imperialism. Now, you just made that point. Things that should, because I took notes as you were talking here, things that we should be protesting and resisting against. What they do is to calm us by giving us a little 2 cents here and a 2 cents there. In other words, I think it was Malcolm X who said it, or another political thinker who said it. What they do is to cut away your right hand and your left foot and give you a crutch and tell you that that crutch can suffice for the loss of your limbs. And this is colonization. It creates handicaps. And this is the modern version of colonization, neo-colonialism, and its ideological component, neoliberalism. In other words, they cut off your hand, cut off your foot, and then they give you a crutch and say, you should be happy. And that, in many instances, according to people like Peter Hallward and others, is the role that the modern NGO plays, right? One of the things he goes on to say also, right, is that they have been accused of weakening people by allowing their funders to prioritize stability over social justice and social equity, right? Workers from NGO participating in local communities allege that NGO prioritizes their special interest over the community well-being. So for example, like the Blue Bond in Belize and certain environmental issues, right? They don't care sometimes how these things impact the population. They just promote their agenda. Like, for example, there is an NGO right now promoting that the US should bomb Iran in order for women to be relieved of the hijab. So this is the agenda of the US. Regime change. But this NGO masquerades as if it's supporting women and the liberation of women, and so kill the woman in order for them not to wear the hijab. And this is a classic example of how a lot of the NGO does work.
One of the things too, Brother Akko, is that NGOs' loyalty is to funders, not to people. Exactly. And so that's why whatever the funder agenda is, because when you're applying for this funding, they tell you what the agenda is. And even if that's not what the organization's agenda is, they want to shift and change it for match what the funder say, because they want the money. So then take you off track as an organization because you want that money. And then they turn you into like one beggar nation. So you have the politician where give you crumbs and you're satisfied. and then you're licky because of the NGO, because you want for their money. So that like, we the people always in a like victim mode. We can't help ourselves. And like you shared at the beginning of this conversation, we the people who have demonstrated for generations to be self-sufficient, to be creative, to have pride in ourselves, to work together as a community.
Yeah, and that's just support the point. I supported the point you made earlier with the quote, "Whose bread I eat is whose song I sing." So whoever fund you, those are the voices you're going to listen to, and those are the songs you're going to sing. You know, and the funding of the NGO usually is not indigenous, not endogenous. In other words, it doesn't come from the community. And this is what we have to return to. I mean, if you look at what is happening in Burkina Faso right now, this is what Captain Ibrahim Traore has done. In order to develop his country, he has found funding from inside the country, not from the World Bank, not from the IMF, not from the African Bank, which is an extension of the IMF. He mobilized the people to support their own development. And this is what we had in the Caribbean at some point in time until our leadership adopted these systems and abdicated their responsibility to lead the people in a different direction. And so now what we have more and more are these outside influences having outsized influences on our polity, our economics, and our social discourse because they fund us. And this is happening not just in the Caribbean, it is happening in Africa. There is a Tanzanian author, Issa Shivji, who has written on what he calls silences in the NGO discourse on the role of NGOs in Africa. And he says that despite the good intentions of some NGO leaders and activities, he is critical of the objective effects of their actions regardless of their intentions. According to him, they are part of this neoliberal paradigm that I mentioned, and they are not purely motivated by goodwill and altruism. Right? He said they want to change the world without understanding it, continuing the imperial and imperialist tradition. And so this is what we are dealing with. And there is no serious discourse on this. In fact, the only serious discourse that, in my mind, from a leader that emerged from this is when Vladimir Putin, at the Munich Security Conference, I think maybe 10 years ago, he rose the role that the NGOs were playing in Russia. And eventually the Russian Duma parliament passed a law that if you are an NGO and you are serving the interests of foreign entities, you should register as a foreign enterprise or something like that, a foreign agent, right? And we in the Caribbean, we have not gotten to that point. Some of these organizations are clearly working not in the interest of our country, of our countries. And we have no law protecting our sovereignty. And this is an important thing here. We are, if we ever had it, whatever little sovereignty we had in the Caribbean, we are losing it. And our leaders, both at the political level, the economic level, and the social level, do not seem to understand the importance of sovereignty. And so these NGOs in particular, they are Trojan horses. And if people understand the concept of the Trojan horse, it was a story in which the Trojans were given a gift, I think, by the Greeks, and it was a horse, and they felt that it was such a pretty thing, and they were all happy that they got this great gift. But in the Trojan horse were soldiers who sneaked out in the night and burnt the city down. And so, to some extent, in my view and the view of many others, this is the role that NGOs are playing in terms of undermining our sovereignty and creating open spaces for neoliberalism and US imperialism and European imperialism to dominate our society in ways they couldn't do before, because we were aware of what was happening and we fought. This is a thing that puts you to sleep. And as you are sleeping, they are telling you they are doing good, meanwhile undermining your sovereignty, taking away your life, and totally destroying your initiative and your ability to do things for yourself.
We have another 5 minutes, so this will be the last question I'll ask you, Brother Akon. I appreciate the knowledge and wisdom you shared with this morning. Yesterday we had Brother Darius Figuera on. You know, he wrote the book, Belize, Human Smuggling, Transnational Organized Crime, Politicians and Public Servants. And he made the point that throughout the Caribbean, because we have cut and paste constitution, the British-speaking Caribbean that is, as it relates to our constitution, the Westminster system, that it never designed for give people the quality of life that we born for have. So understanding that framework and understanding the role of NGOs and politicians who betray way, they have a good understanding of the landscape and they want to make sure they have the financial wealth at the expense of the public purse oftentimes. I mean, what are we to do, Brother Akko, within what framework like that? Brother Dara said he not believing in being hopeless. But what, in listening to all that you shared this morning about non-governmental organization, and I have some young people where they chase them degrees and hope one NGO hiring. They get for travel, they meet people where they think they're not people, then get opportunities where they never had before. So then see this as a good thing. And then buy into whatever the, let's say, an environmental organization might set up for their mandate. So what are we to do, Brother Akko?
What are we to do, Sister Yaya? The same thing we have been doing. Fight. The same thing Bob Marley said. It takes a revolution to bring a solution. We have to mobilize ourselves around our own ideas, around our own interests. And we have to fight in areas where we have influence. We have, for example, to demand that we get an education that focuses on our own humanity, our own history, our own cultural struggles, and so on. Right now, our education throughout the Caribbean is based on a model that undermines our independence of thought, undermines our self-confidence, and is very Eurocentric. This is why you are fighting a battle to a policy battle in Belize, and the brother we had last week, Shabaka, is fighting the same thing in Trinidad and other parts of the Caribbean. That in our education system, our cultural artifacts and our cultural expressions are undermined. We have to fight at those levels to ensure that in the education system and in the spaces that we fought for, that there is some kind of freedom there, that there is some kind of liberation there. And that is what I like, Brother Darius. I am not a person who believes in hopelessness, right? There is always something we can do. And even this conversation we're having this morning, the conversations we have on Sunday, the things we do on Haiti, all of these things are raising consciousness. It may not appear to be much, but as the old people say, one cocoa fill the basket. And if we do our individual parts, right, on a consistent and regular basis and do it with honesty, we will eventually change. As Mao Zedong would say, imperialism is a paper tiger. Right? It looks ferocious. It looks as if it is overwhelming, but it is not. You know, there is a statement they use, and I always laugh at it. You know, as a young child, you would read about 20,000 troops and 50,000 troops, and the way that was put in your head is like if it's something that is undefeatable. As I came to understand things better, 50,000 troops are 50 men, 50,000 men who bleed, who if shot could be killed, you know, and so on. And we have to understand things and know his own basic things, because language is also used to create blocks and challenges in our minds that undermine our self-confidence. And I would tell you this, in my opinion, one of the fundamental issues facing the Caribbean people right now is the winning of our self-confidence. We are losing an ability in our own sense of self and our own abilities to do things. And that is what we have to restore. Our political systems, our education systems, our social systems, our cultural systems must be organized to serve us in that way. The late Lloyd Best used to say something, because a lot of our leaders would talk about how small our size were and all of that stuff. And he would say size is not a problem, right? Size produces comparative advantages. What we have to find is what is our comparative advantage. what comparative advantages our small size, our locations where we are, offers us. And then when we discover these comparative advantages, how do we utilize them to dominate the world? The West Indies cricket team did it and dominated the world in cricket for years, right? With nation, against nation like India with how many thousand times our population. The Jamaican athletes do it all the time. So we have advantages, but our education and social systems are not encouraging us to understand these advantages. And that is what we must focus on. What are our advantages and how can we use those advantages to advance our own agendas on our own cause and our own civilization?
Big thanks, brother Mutota from Trinidad, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, going to have a reason with her this Sunday morning. We have two big guests. What the guest their name, brother Akko? We're talking about capitalism. I mean, we're talking about militarism in the Caribbean.
Dr. Thame of Jamaica and Corey Juice, an independent researcher from Trinidad and Tobago.
That's this Sunday on XTV Creme Radio, 10:30 to noon. Break time. Thanks, brother Akko. See you Sunday morning.
All right, thank you very much.